Hello, my name's Paddy. I'm the Mind Guy. I'm a mental health advocate and logistics consultant, and I've helped hundreds of professionals with their mental health challenges in and out of the workplace. April's Stress Awareness Month, so I'm speaking to professionals across the logistics industry about stress to find out what they've got to say on the matter. Today, I'm joined by Steve Barraclough. He's a retired logistics project manager who specialised in automation installs. Steve and I met when we worked together at Hatmill, a logistics and supply chain consultancy. So, morning, Steve. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very well, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Right, we're going to dive straight in there. As I've said, as I've already said, you are retired. But can you tell us a little bit about your time in the industry? How did you get where you are?
So I studied transport management at Aston University, did a gap year in transport and got bitten by the bug. So went into the industry initially, as I say, in transport, and then migrated into warehousing through some advice from a chap who I met, and fell into automation as a niche. So I ended up working at a site that was fully automated, and I worked all the way through to site general management level. And then I took a bit of a career sort of tangent and ended up going into project management, having been given an opportunity to do a large-scale project to design and build an automated facility. So did a few of those, which was just absolutely unbelievable. And then more latterly, I got into program and change management, doing some of the bigger stuff, which was equally interesting. Had the opportunity to run my own consultancy business, so was a consultant project manager, doing projects for blue chip companies. And then my last gig, as you've kindly mentioned, was working for Hatmill before I had the opportunity to rather jealously take early retirement.
Just gonna say you were thoroughly smug. The last time I saw you before retirement, you were very smug. We walked around with a T-shirt saying, I can't remember what it said, but it said something like "The legend has left" or something like that.
The legend has retired. If you want to speak to me, it'll cost you a consultancy fee.
So I take that very seriously now.
Had to be done.
Yeah. So obviously you've talked there about managing big automation projects and automated sites and things like that. So I expect you'll have a good answer to this next one, which is, what did you find stressful about that?
I don't think this will come as too much as a surprise to your listeners. I think it's common in any role, project or line management, whatever, is the usual financial and time constraints that certainly came with either being a general manager, getting products out of the door to the required quality levels, and similarly in projects. So they were always prevalent. One of the things that it's kind of was more of a wind-up, but that led to sort of a little bit of anxiety and stress, was very much around people. So where there were blockers, people in particular that didn't take responsibility, that used to wind me up and add to my personal stress levels. Politics and bureaucracy I couldn't abide, having worked in large global blue chip companies and the like, and that was one of the beautiful things of working in Hatmill, where that just didn't exist. That was fabulous. And I came across in one of my later roles a complete lack of senior sponsorship and support and accountability from a sponsor whose name was signed on a contract, but he denied he was the sponsor of the programme. And my stress levels went through the roof. So largely speaking there, I guess what I'm alluding to is the people dynamics in business. You can't run any business without people, and people tended to be usually on the stress thermometer for me, good or bad. But yeah,
that makes sense. So for you, it sounds like a lot of that was to do with support and like I said, the people you were surrounded by to get the job done, basically.
I think it's particularly worth mentioning that in project management, you generally are working in matrix world, because whilst you might have a couple of direct reports in PMO and things like that, you're working with people from business functions in work streams who you have no direct line authority over. So you have to use influencing skills, etc., etc. And again, depending on, excuse me, how well that project's been structured and sponsored, depends on the different levels of, maturity, of responsibility, accountability of an organisation, of leadership, and of individuals. And if it's done really well, the stress levels are significantly lower. If it's done badly, you're putting the Superman red cape and red underpants on, and you sometimes feel like you're fighting the world. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And it can be very lonely. I remember a colleague of mine, I'd had a 360 review that actually didn't come out very well, and they actually interviewed some of my peer group because they were quite concerned about the results. And this particular chap said, have you stopped to think how lonely it must be for Steve? He's out there and he's leading this, and he's actually not really got a lot of support around him. And that actually resonated, and they did something about it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we talked about just before starting recording is, so obviously Steve and I used to work together at Hat Mill, and we'll in a later episode we'll talk about that, because actually it's been really, for me, starting the Mind Guy MacBrant has been a really influential organisation to be involved with. But one of the things that kind of typifies it is a lack of hierarchy. They've got the business has no hierarchy whatsoever. It works on something called teal organisations. Like I say, we'll talk about it later. But one of the things that is required of managerial level is feedback and support of individuals to help them progress through their career and progress through the ranks of the organisation. And so in Hatmill, they provide coaches, basically, who are independent of the business. And it's one of those things that helps with the loneliness. Being a consultant is quite a lonely job, and being a project manager is quite a lonely job. And so it was one of the things that we've both talked about, how useful that experience is. And later on in this podcast, we'll be interviewing a couple of life coaches as well, because they're really useful people to have involved in this kind of thing. But it's part of the reason that with what I do now, that's one of the things that we include, is because it is really lonely being a senior member of team or whatever, or just having things on your plate that you can't necessarily cope with. So, enough about me. Talking about people stress and things like that, what sort of effect does that have on you? Surely that kind of impacts you in some way, or impacted you. I've got to use this all as a past tense.
Yeah, well, I've had time to obviously reflect on this a little bit. For me, and I'm conscious, stress affects people differently. For me, there were a couple of physical signals. So I suffer from eczema, mild eczema, and I've had a couple of occasions where I got really stressed through work, and eczema flare-ups to the point of having to go and see the doctor and get lashings of cream and unpleasant things like that. So that was one physical manifestation. The other thing is, if I get a cold sore, it generally is related to the fact that I'm starting to feel stressed and run down. And I've known quite a few people that get that. The other obvious ones, and I'm probably not alone on this, but, I tended to get, on occasion, somewhat irritable. As things are stressful, and particularly being a project lead, very task focused, driving people, I'd go in very much into doing mode, and I could be perceived as just being a complete misery in a bad mood, when actually I was just being incredibly focused. But what probably did come out of that is I could occasionally be very blunt. I am a black and white Yorkshireman. I tell it as it is, and when the pressure was on, I could probably sometimes border on coming across as just being rude. And even I was accused once upon a time of being aggressive. And on reflection of that, you look back and you go, actually, there was probably a grain of truth in that. That was the pressure, and that was how I reacted. So that's the old adage of feedback's a gift. And actually, on reflection, I think that was fair. Not a nice thing to say. Well, I was quite blunt and rude and sometimes borderline aggressive, but that's the truth, and you have to face into that to try and change to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, definitely. And that must be really hard feedback to hear as well.
Well, yeah, but like anything, if it's done in the right way, and and you're given specific examples of why they perceived you to be like that, and you can then reflect on it properly and go, do you know what? Whilst I don't like the feedback, I don't like that. Actually, there's some truth in it. I need to work a little bit harder because like most people, I never used to go to work to cheese people off and upset them. But as I said, in terms of what did I find stressful, if I got to the point certainly later in life, if I had somebody that wasn't towing the line, I got to the point where I didn't suffer fools gladly. I just wouldn't tolerate it. And sometimes perhaps I went a little bit too far, but it generally worked. It was a bit of a hammer to crack a nut, But yeah, on reflection, those were the sorts of things that were my signals to say, hey, look, you're starting to get wound up here.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about sort of some of the physical manifestations around like cold sores and eczema and things like that. And another one that's really common is ulcers, like mouth ulcers. A lot of people get mouth ulcers. I certainly do.
Right.
And it's one of the things that people recognise early on. It's not early on. For some people, it's one of the earliest indications they recognise. But like you say, if you take that back a bit more, looking at irritability and things like that, actually, it's a much better litmus test, really, for that kind of thing. So, apart from being, in your own words, aggressive, how do you... I'm sorry.
Put them up.
How did you manage that stress?
So, I've thought about this, and I've sort of split it into sort of positives and negatives. So, let's start with the positives. So, I am actually very well organised and very disciplined. So in terms of getting through, a tremendous amount of workload and keeping things on point, they were things that helped me cope. I'm blessed that I was good at that. The other thing, which I don't think people necessarily think about consciously, is it's really important, particularly in logistics, such a fast-moving industry, to make sure that you plan holidays, take time out at regular intervals to just de-stress. And I did that mostly well, other than one gig in Atmel where I got it completely wrong and nearly burnt myself out. But that was my fault. Things that I did wrong, and this kind of comes into jumping the gun sort of tips for people on similar journeys. Certainly pre-coded, getting up and leaving the house at 7 and having an hour's journey and not getting home till 7. If I'd had a bad day, it was a large gin and tonic or a whiskey. So I drank too much, and I'm, believe it or not, Paddy, I'm drinking very little at the moment in comparison. I just don't feel the want I need. I've lost over a stone in weight, and I feel better for it. So actually, that's a real, good example of why drinking lots isn't good for you. Everybody knows the medical impacts on that. The other thing, because I was having long days, I just convinced myself it was easier to have a gin and tonic rather than go for a 20-minute walk or do 20 minutes on the exercise bike. And I've never been good, even when I was a fit young rugby player. I've never been good at exercising, but I just never exercised enough, and I used the work as an excuse. I'm too tired. Just wrong. The other thing I thought worked for me, and it did up to a point, was I'd come home and my defence mechanism was I would just switch off and I would not talk to my partner about work. And that worked. It helped me compartmentalise. But in fairness, what we were talking about earlier is you need to offload. You need somebody to talk to. And if that's your partner, how was work, rather than just saying, I don't want to talk about work, just say I had a bad day and here's why. So, so I didn't do those three things at all well, in all honesty and on all reflection. So, don't do those things, guys. Don't do what I did. It's not good for you.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, yeah. I mean, those are all really common coping mechanisms, I guess, for definite. So, like you say, you've jumped the gun slightly, but your top tip for someone else on a similar journey to you?
So it gets talked about an awful lot, but it's so true, and it links to what I've just said. You've got to look at your work-life balance. You have to plan things in like exercise, holidays, time out to switch off and to cope. You need to have people you can talk to. So, as you mentioned in Hat Mill, having a Paddy or a Nicola in terms of a coaching sense, somebody to talk to, as well as the peer group review and working in self-managing teams. I think reflecting on that just emphasised how important that is. I think in terms of going back to what I said about what I found stressful, which was very much people-centric, I would encourage people, particularly coming into this industry or any walks of life, is learn people skills. I was reasonably adept, but I could have done more and I could have been better at it. So things like understanding body language, influencing skills, how to manage conflict, and even considering as unpleasant as it might be based on feedback given to you, is look at anger management techniques and skills, so you don't actually get angry with people and you don't show it. So those would be things that I'd encourage people to do, and then understand. This won't surprise you as a program geek. Understand change management and the psychology of people within change, because change is prevalent. And I guess what I'm saying is it's all about people. And as they say in Yorkshire, Paddy, there's no so queer as folk. So understand people.
Definitely. Steve, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you again.
And you, mate, it's been good to catch up.
Grand. Thank you so much. And I will speak to the listeners. I will speak to you all later on.